June 25, 1948. The air above Tempelhof Airport in Berlin shimmered with heat and tension. The city below was starving. For months, Soviet forces had sealed every rail line and road, choking off the 2 million souls trapped inside the western sectors. Food was scarce, coal scarcer. Electricity flickered like a dying candle. But at 1,500 feet above the smog and ruin, a C-54 Skymaster thundered low across the rooftops, its engines steady, defiant. Inside the cockpit sat Lieutenant Gale S. Halverson of the U.S. Air Force, tired, sweat-soaked, but alive with purpose. His call sign, Uncle Wiggly Wings. The name would come later. For now, he was just one of hundreds of pilots flying endless supply runs to keep Berlin breathing. Each mission was simple but perilous. Take off from Rhine-Main Air Base in West Germany, cross the narrow corridors of Soviet-controlled airspace, land at Tempelhof, unload, and fly back out before nightfall. The C-54 groaned under its load, sacks of flour, dried milk, and coal briquettes stacked to the ceiling. Below, children stood near the craters and rubble, watching these silver birds glide in, their shadows sweeping across shattered apartment blocks. For many of them, this was the only reminder that someone, somewhere, hadn't forgotten them. Halverson had seen those faces before. Just days earlier, on the other side of the barbed wire at Tempelhof, he had met a group of children, thin, pale, polite beyond their years. They didn't beg for food. They didn't ask for help. They just watched the planes and smiled, their eyes following the cargo ships as if they were angels. When Halverson reached into his pocket, all he had were 2 sticks of Wrigley's gum. He tore them in half, handed them to the kids. The children who didn't get a piece didn't cry. They leaned in, just to smell the wrapper. That small moment stayed with him long after he walked back to his barracks. That night, as the generators hummed and the city slept in darkness, he stared at a chocolate bar sitting on his bunk. And that's when he had an idea. An idea so simple it almost felt absurd. He'd drop candy for the kids. The next day, Halverson stood by the tail of his aircraft, a roll of string in hand, tying tiny parachutes made of handkerchiefs and scraps of cloth. Chocolate, gum, hard candy, all gathered from rations and donations. His crew watched, half amused. "What are you doing, Hal?" one called out. "Making friends," he said with a grin. "The kind that lasts longer than wars." He told the children to watch for the plane that wiggled its wings as it approached. "That'll be me," he said. "Keep your eyes open." When the engines roared to life and the C-54 climbed into the sky, Halverson felt a nervous energy in his chest. This wasn't an authorized drop. Command hadn't approved anything of the sort. But as the plane swept over the battered rooftops of Berlin, he dipped the wings twice, a signal. The children looked up, pointing, shouting. Then from the cargo bay, the first bundles fell, fluttering softly, glinting in the sunlight. For a moment, there was silence, then laughter, bright and wild and real. Children scrambled through the rubble, chasing the drifting parachutes as they touched down. Some held their prizes high, others tore them open on the spot, the sweetness melting on tongues that hadn't tasted sugar in months. Up in the cockpit, Halverson couldn't see them clearly, but he could imagine. And for the first time since the war, he felt that the sky over Germany wasn't a symbol of fear, but of hope. Down below, word spread quickly. The Berliners began calling him Der Schokoladenflieger, the chocolate pilot. And for many who had once hidden from Allied bombers, the idea that American planes now dropped candy, not destruction, felt like something out of a dream. But dreams have a way of drawing attention, especially in the military. Within days, Halverson's small act of kindness would catch the eyes of his superiors, his comrades, and eventually the world. 3 days after his first candy drop, Lieutenant Halverson was summoned to his commanding officer's office at Tempelhof. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke, the blinds drawn to block the midday glare. Colonel James R. Hahn sat behind his desk, a folder open before him. "Lieutenant," he said, not looking up, "we've been getting letters." Halverson stiffened. "Yes, sir?" "Letters," Hahn repeated, "from Berliners. Thank you notes. For candy." He finally met Halverson's eyes. Care to explain why the 17th Air Transport Squadron is apparently conducting an unsanctioned confectionery campaign? Halverson swallowed hard. Sir, I dropped a few candy bars for the children near the fence. Used handkerchiefs for parachutes. It seemed, he hesitated. It seemed like the right thing to do. For a long moment, the colonel said nothing. Then he exhaled a slow plume of smoke and leaned back in his chair. You're lucky, Lieutenant. General Tunner loves this kind of morale story. By the next morning, word had spread through the base. Operation Little Vittles, they were calling it, a play on the name of the entire airlift, Operation Vittles. And now it wasn't just Halverson. Pilots from across the squadrons began contributing candy from their rations, pooling chocolate, gum, and sweets from home. Letters from America began arriving too, small boxes wrapped with care, each one marked, "For the children of Berlin." Soon the simple act of kindness became a full-fledged mission. Crews tied parachutes by the hundreds. Their bunks turned into assembly lines of laughter and string. Even the brass got involved. The press picked up the story, dubbing Halverson the Candy Bomber. Tempelhof buzzed with new energy. Between the grinding drone of cargo engines and the smell of aviation fuel, there was a hum of purpose that hadn't existed since the war's end. The men who had once dropped bombs over Europe now dropped hope. Tiny parachutes that glimmered like stars over a city divided by politics and hunger. One afternoon, as Halverson's C-54 banked over the ruined streets of the American sector, he spotted them again. Children waving from the ground, their hands outstretched. He gave the signal, wiggling the wings twice, and the cargo hatch opened. The bundles tumbled free, spinning and dancing in the sunlight. From above, they looked like snowflakes. Down below, 7-year-old Ingrid Wolf stood barefoot on the cobblestones, her hair tangled, her dress patched a dozen times. When the parachutes began to fall, she gasped. "Chocolat!" she cried, sprinting toward a bundle that landed beside a broken wall. Inside was a single Hershey bar, wrapped in silver. She took one bite and closed her eyes. For the first time in her young life, she smiled without fear. News of these moments spread like wildfire through Berlin. Radio broadcasts and newspapers shared stories of children catching candy from the heavens. Mothers wept as they told neighbors how American pilots, once enemies, were now angels in uniform. The Soviets, however, were less amused. Propaganda leaflets accused the Americans of poisoning German children's minds with sweets. But the candy kept falling, and the laughter kept echoing through the streets. No wall of ideology could drown out the sound of joy. By autumn, Operation Little Vittles had grown beyond anything Halverson had imagined. Over 250,000 parachutes had been dropped, carrying more than 23 tons of candy. Schools and churches in the United States sent donations by the ton: chocolate, chewing gum, peppermint, even tiny notes written by American children to their German counterparts. To a new friend in Berlin, Halverson received piles of letters addressed simply to the chocolate pilot. Some included drawings, crayon sketches of airplanes with smiling faces, and little parachutes trailing behind. Others included heartfelt words of thanks written in shaky English. "You have made us believe again." But as the operation grew, so too did the risks. The Berlin Airlift was still a dangerous mission. Soviet fighters shadowed American cargo planes, and collisions were a constant threat in the congested skies. Every pilot knew that a single mistake could bring tragedy. Yet amidst the tension, Operation Little Vittles continued, a defiant symbol of kindness amid a city once drowned in war. By December 1948, the frozen air over Berlin was filled with the hum of propellers and the faint sparkle of candy parachutes. In a place once synonymous with destruction, the sound of Allied engines had become a promise, proof that compassion could rise from the ashes of hate. But the story was far from over. For Lieutenant Halverson, what began as an act of spontaneous generosity would soon transform into something far greater, a movement that would help reshape the world's perception of post-war Germany and of America's role in it. January 1949. Berlin lay under a thick shroud of snow. The ruins were ghostly white, and the cold crept through every crack in every wall. In the western sectors, families huddled together around makeshift stoves, burning scraps of wood and furniture just to keep warm. The Soviets' blockade was still choking the city, And every pound of food, every lump of coal that reached Berlin came from the sky. Through blizzards and fog, the airlift continued, 3 planes landing every minute, day and night. The pilots called it the Sky Bridge, a lifeline held together by courage, discipline, and steel nerves. And among those planes, one stood out, Halverson's C-54, its wings known by every child in Berlin. Even as the bitter wind tore across the runways, children still gathered outside Tempelhof's wire fences, their cheeks red from the cold, their eyes scanning the sky. They waited for the wiggle, the unmistakable tilt of wings that meant candy was coming. Inside the cockpit, Halverson and his crew worked through exhaustion. Their hands were stiff from the chill, their uniforms reeking of oil and coffee. But the morale aboard his aircraft was unmatched. The Little Vittles crates were stacked neatly in the rear, each labeled with names of the American towns that had sent them: Cincinnati, Denver, Boston, San Francisco. The packages carried not just candy, but letters of kindness, stuffed animals, drawings, even knitted scarves. "Look at this," said Sergeant Ralph Taylor, holding up a box covered in a child's handwriting. "To the kids in Berlin, we love you. Don't give up." Halverson smiled, his eyes tired but alive. "Let's make sure they get it," he said. At 800 feet above the rooftops, the plane released its load. The parachutes drifted down in clusters, bright against the gray sky. Below, the children erupted into shouts of joy. The airfield guards, once annoyed by the crowd, began waving too. It wasn't just candy falling, it was dignity, restored piece by piece. In the months that followed, the friendship between Berlin's children and the American airmen deepened. Kids began leaving thank you notes tied to little stones along the airfield fence. Some contained drawings of their favorite planes. Others simply said, "Danke, Onkel Wackelflügel." "Thank you, Uncle Wiggle Wings." One note in particular caught Halverson's heart. It was from a young girl named Mercedes Simon, who lived near Tempelhof. She wrote, "Dear Chocolate Uncle, please drop the candy near the White House with the garden. I will wave to you so you know it is me." Halverson smiled when he read it. On his next flight, he watched carefully for the landmark, a White House with a small, snow-covered yard. As he spotted a tiny figure waving a handkerchief, he dropped a bundle just for her. It landed perfectly. Months later, when the blockade ended, Halverson met Mercedes in person. She gave him a hug so fierce it nearly broke him. Moments like that spread through Berlin like embers in the cold. People began referring to the American pilots not as conquerors, but as Luftbrücke Engel, air bridge angels. For a nation that had seen its cities burned and its faith in humanity shattered, this compassion from former enemies was almost impossible to comprehend. The Soviets tried to mock it in their propaganda broadcasts. "The Americans are wasting sugar on children while the world starves," they sneered. But even some Soviet soldiers stationed near the city were seen watching the candy drops from afar, smiling faintly. No ideology could erase what was happening in the skies above Berlin. A simple truth taking shape. Compassion was stronger than resentment. By spring 1949, the blockade began to crack. The constant stream of aircraft, combined with global political pressure, forced the Soviets to reconsider. Supplies were flowing faster than ever, and Berliners no longer lived in terror of starvation. The candy drops, though small compared to the scale of the airlift, had achieved something no amount of military force could. They had healed hearts. On May 12, 1949, the blockade officially ended. The roads reopened. Trains rolled again, and the city erupted in celebration. Bells rang across church towers that had once been silent, and people embraced in the streets. But even amid the cheers, thousands still looked to the sky, half expecting to see the wiggling wings of Halverson's plane. When the last official candy drop took place, hundreds of Berliners gathered near the runway. Children waved handmade flags. Halverson stood by his C-54, now decorated with drawings and signatures from kids across the city. As his engine started, he leaned out of the cockpit, waved once more, and took off into a sky that finally seemed peaceful. From that moment on, the man from Utah was no longer just an airlift pilot. He was a symbol, the candy bomber, the man who turned warplanes into messengers of mercy. But the legacy of Operation Little Vittles didn't end in 1949. It would follow Halverson for decades. through reunions, letters, and memories that refuse to fade. Because for the children of Berlin, those tiny parachutes carried more than candy. They carried proof that even in the aftermath of war, kindness could fall from the heavens. Summer, 1949. The roar of Allied aircraft still echoed across Berlin, though now it was a sound of reassurance, not dread. The blockade had been lifted, but the gratitude it inspired did not fade. Children still looked skyward when they heard engines overhead, half expecting to see those familiar, wiggling wings. Lieutenant Gale Halvorson had been reassigned by then, his mission complete. Yet even as he packed his duffel bag and prepared to leave Germany, letters kept pouring in. Hundreds, then thousands. Some came from Berlin's children, others from American families who had followed his story in the newspapers. He read them late at night, each one a reminder that something extraordinary had happened. Something beyond strategy, beyond orders. He wasn't alone in realizing it. When the U.S. Air Force held a ceremony to mark the end of Operation Little Vittles, Halvorson was called to the podium. Generals, diplomats, and reporters filled the hangar. But it was the group of German children standing in the front row, smiling, clutching chocolate wrappers and paper parachutes, that left him momentarily speechless. He cleared his throat and said simply, "It wasn't just candy we dropped. It was hope." The audience fell silent, and for a brief moment, the ghosts of war seemed to recede into the background. Over the next decades, the legend of the candy bomber grew. Halvorson returned to the United States, married, raised a family, and continued his career in the Air Force. But wherever he went, the memory of those Berlin children followed him. He kept in touch with some of them. Letters exchanged over years, friendships that survived oceans and generations. In 1974, he was invited back to Berlin. The city had changed, divided now by a concrete wall and guarded checkpoints. Still, when Halvorson stepped off the plane at Tempelhof, crowds gathered to greet him. Children, now adults, held signs that read, "Welcome back, Uncle Wiggly Wings." Some brought their own children, eager to show them the man who once turned warplanes into symbols of kindness. One woman approached him, tears in her eyes. "Do you remember the White House?" she asked softly. Halvorson's face broke into a grin. "Mercedes," he said, recognizing her instantly. She handed him a photo of herself as a child, holding a candy parachute. In that moment, both of them laughed, the years melting away like chocolate on a warm day. The two remained friends for life. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, Halvorson was invited once again to Tempelhof. Now an old man with a gentle smile and silver hair, he stood before a crowd of thousands. Planes roared overhead in salute. Children, German, American, British, released balloons into the sky. Each carried a small tag that read, "From hope, we are free." When Halvorson spoke, his voice trembled but never wavered. "What we did then wasn't about candy," he said. "It was about showing the world that one act of kindness can build a bridge stronger than any wall." Over the years, his story would inspire countless others. School children in both Germany and the U.S. studied Operation Little Vittles as a symbol of reconciliation. Museums displayed his tiny parachutes. The very plane he once flew, the C-54 Spirit of Freedom, became a flying memorial, touring the world to remind people that compassion has no borders. Even in his final years, Halvorson continued visiting schools and speaking to young pilots. He always carried a piece of candy in his pocket, ready to give away. "You never know," he'd say with a wink, "when you'll meet someone who needs a little sweetness." When he passed away in 2022, tributes poured in from around the world. The German government called him a symbol of humanity. In Berlin, children left chocolate bars at the base of the Airlift Memorial, and for one day, dozens of small white parachutes floated once more through the air above Tempelhof. For the people of Berlin, the memory of Onkel Wackelflügel never faded. He had turned a time of despair into a moment of wonder. Where there had once been bombers, there were now angels of mercy. Where there had once been rubble, there were stories of laughter and hope. And in every generation since, those stories remind us of something timeless. That even in the aftermath of the darkest wars, a single act of kindness can illuminate the sky. The children of Berlin once watched the heavens in fear. Thanks to a soft-spoken pilot from Utah, they learned to look up again, with wonder.